My name is Adam Jahr. I am with Vue Mastery, and this morning I want to invite you all on an adventure. Who wants to go on an adventure this morning? Okay, most of you. Cool. Except maybe the people who stayed up till like 2 a.m. Maybe not ready. So we are going on an adventure deep into space to a planet called Vuetopia. Yes, not quite utopia, but close. So we are going on a quest for some hidden knowledge. We hear that there is an ancient temple that contains some information that we are questing for. So we're going to head towards that, and heck, why not go inside? Inside we find the Vue Oracle, who we can ask questions to, and she'll provide answers to us. So we're going to open up a portal this morning and learn about the wonderful world of Vuex. So when we're talking about Vuex, we're really talking about state management. So what does that even mean? Well, basically, as your component tree grows in your application, the complexity of the state that your components are managing and communicating amongst themselves, that grows as well. So state management increasingly becomes more of an issue to solve. So Facebook discovered this the hard way. The result of that was the flux-based design pattern, and that's what Vuex is designed after, also what Redux is designed after. So Vuex is a full state management pattern and library, and it helps us manage the state of our components. So without it, each individual component within our app might be having its own state. So when I say state, that might be something like a Boolean or a collection of data, let's say blog posts or to-do items or notifications. So if, say, this child needs to communicate something about its state to its distant relative across the component tree, the non-Vuex, kind of traditional way you might think of to do that would be to send that up via events and down via props. But that can get quite messy. It's not very scalable. There's a lot of ways that can go wrong and be just increasingly more and more of a headache. So wouldn't it be nice, instead of all of these little individual states, if we could collapse them, aggregate them into one central state, or in other words, one single source of truth. So this is what Vuex provides for us, and it allows all of the different components in our app to directly access that state versus try to manage the state amongst themselves. And just like the data in your Vue components, the state is reactive. So what that means is if this little child were to update state and that distant cousin were to be listening for changes on that state, then it could receive it reactively when it changed. So we'll look at what that actually looks like in code in just a bit. But just having one centralized global store for your state doesn't solve all the problems of state management, because if different components are kind of updating state in different ways from different locations, things can become a bit unpredictable and untraceable. So we need ways to kind of document and keep track of how state changes are being made to our Vuex store. So fortunately, Vuex comes with a whole store, which is the pattern for state management. And if you know anything about Vue components, it's going to look pretty similar to the Vue instance. So if we were to create a new Vue instance, it would look like this. And with a new store, it would look like that. So a component is going to have its data. The Vuex store is going to have its state, both of which are reactive. And then the component's going to have its methods, which of course can do many things, one of which it can update the data, and the actions can update the state. A component might have a computed property, which can be basically reactively computing values and changing based on those dependencies. That's similar to excuse me, a getter. And getters allow us to basically take state, process, maybe filter it in a way, and return that kind of computed process version of our state. So the difference here with Vuex is Vuex has mutations. So mutations are what commit and track state changes. So I know that I just said that the actions allow us to change and update the state. And that's because they work together with mutations to do so. So I know when I was learning about it, this was a bit confusing for me, but you can imagine actions a bit like wrappers that wrap mutations, a single mutation or multiple, and it can combine that with some business logic. So you can run an action that commits multiple mutations to your state. And the good thing about the Vue dev tools is that it allows for time travel debugging, so we can essentially rewind in time and see what the different state was at the time that those state changes were made based on those mutations. So let's look at an example, Vuex Store. So here in the state we have a loading status and an empty to-dos array. And then we are going to add a couple mutations. So we have a set loading status. It takes the state of the loading status and sets it equal to whatever status was passed into it. And similar to that is the set to-dos, where it takes the state of our to-dos, sets it equal to whatever to-dos we pass into it. And here's our action. Of course, more code, so we're going to go through it line by line. So this context object essentially it gives us access to all the properties on the Vuex store so that we can do things like commit mutations and get access to the state. So we're passing in the context object and then doing a number of things. So we're committing the loading status, setting it to loading. We are then going to make an API call. When that response gets back, we can commit again the set loading status, setting it back to not loading. And then, since we now have that response, we can commit the set to-dos and set our state of to-dos equal to what we got back from that API call. And I mentioned getters earlier, so if we wanted to get this state now, we could write out a getter that looks a bit like this. We could call it done to-dos. It could take in the state and then return a filtered version of that state. Let's say we only wanted the ones that were labeled done. Yep, so grab just those two. Cool. So at Vue Mastery, we spend a lot of time on our slides and animations. We're not comedians like Chris Fritz, so we have to do really pretty slides. So this will hopefully visualize it even better. So taking that same example, we're going to look at it in motion here. So we're going to dispatch the fetch to-dos action, which contain those mutations. And that action is going to run all the logic we just looked at. So it's going to first commit the set loading status, which updates our state to loading, which might display a loading indicator in the component. We're going to fetch our data. When we get it back, then we can commit the next mutation, setting the loading status back to not loading. And then finally, we'll commit the final set to-dos mutation since we have that response back. Update the state with what we got. And if, again, we wanted to just get the ones that were labeled done, we could use a getter for that. So let's see that in action. We would get just the ones that we needed. if we're using time-traveling debugging with the Vue DevTools, we can see a record of a time-stamped record of all those mutations and can see the state at that given time. So that's kind of the high level of how Vuex at least currently works in Vue 2. So let's look at how you actually use it to access state a little more practically. First, I want to show you kind of, if you were, say, had used the Vue CLI and added Vuex, you'd find this store.js file, which would look like this. And in your main.js, you'd find that it was basically inserted for you in your root Vue instance. Cool. So, simple example, if in our store we had some, let's say, user state, how would we get that and display that in our component? So in our template, we could say $store, which gives us access to the store. And then say state to go into the state in the store, and then user and name, which, as I'm sure you can imagine, would display this in the template. But we often don't just want to be accessing our state from the template of our components, so it's a common practice to use computed properties to do this. So how would we refactor this to do so? So we could create a user computed property, which would return, now in this case, this $store.state.user. In our template, we would just now say user.name if we want to display that name. And now we can use user throughout the component, and because this is a computed property, its value is cached until the state changes. Also, Vuex comes with helpers, which are a way to kind of clean up your code and make it a little more readable and take up less lines. So let's look at using a Vuex helper, in this case called map state. So to refactor this, we could simply say map state, pass in an object where the user on, I guess, let's see, my right is the state that we're mapping to, and then we're essentially, there's a function that's returning that state. We could also streamline this a bit, cleaning it up to look like this, which means the same thing we just looked at. If we had multiple pieces of state in our Vuex that our component we're mapping to, we could also pass in an array of just a single string, which would simultaneously mean the piece of state. So like if our state had user, that means user, and it's also the name of the kind of local state that we're calling that, which we're mapping to. So user in this case means our Vuex state and the local state that it's mapped to. Hopefully that makes sense. As you probably noticed, that map state took up the whole computed space. So what if you needed to add a additional kind of local computed property in addition to what you were mapping to in Vuex? The solution there is pretty simple. You would just use the object spread operator. So ... is what that looks like. And then you could add your local computed property. Cool. So I touched on getters a bit before, but right now I want to show you how we can use dynamic getters. So in this case, for example, if we wanted to get a to-do by its specific ID, we could do that in this way. So there's a bunch of arrows. So what's happening here? So it's basically a function that's taking in the state, which is returning a function that's taking in the ID, which is returning the filtered state that is only where it's found only the to-dos by that ID. So in the component, we could use a computed property, call it getToDo by ID, and return this .store.getters.getToDo by ID. And then in the template, do that to get that very specific piece of our state dynamically. Just like we looked at map state, there's also map getters. So we could clean up the code a bit using that, importing it into the component. And then that's as simple as that would look. And you could add as many as you would need for that given component within that array. All right, so we looked at a couple of different ways to get and access the state. So how do we actually mutate it? What does that look like? So like I said before, mutations can update or mutate the Vuex state. So let's say we had a simple state of just one property which had a count value, and we wanted to update that. So in our mutations, we could write a increment count mutation, which takes our state and updates the count by 1. So from the so vernacular, by the way. So we commit mutations, we dispatch actions. We'll get to that in just a minute. So how do we actually commit the mutation from the component? So in this case, we would write a method. We call it increment count and say this $store.commit and pass in the string name of the mutation to run. And then we could trigger that, say, on a button click. So when a user clicks the button, it's going to trigger our method, which is then going to run our mutation, which then kind of clicks forward our state in time, incrementing it by 1. But that was super simple. So let's look at something where we have something a little more dynamic. Let's say we have now a input. So we want to update the state of our count by a number that the user enters in. So we will add to our data. And we're going to pass in that increment by value as a payload, which then our mutation can receive and increment our state by that new dynamic payload. So now, since we are v-modeled to our increment by data value, when a user enters that value, increment by is going to reflect that. So when they hit the button, we're going to run our method, which commits our mutation, passing along the payload, and that will update our state by whatever they entered in. And then this is a kind of screencast of what the dev tools might look like in this case. So as you can see, there's a record being collected of each mutation that's happening with those timestamps. So you can really have good insight into what changed your state, when, and what was the state at that given change. Also, this is quite old version of the Vue dev tools. They're actually much better now. So thanks, Guillaume, right? He works on those? Yeah, thanks, Guillaume. All right, so now we're going to move on to actions, which again they work in harmony with mutations. So let's look at how they do that. So mutations are synchronous, so meaning the order in which they are written are the order in which they're run, whereas actions allow us to do some more asynchronous behavior. So kind of running things out of order if necessary. And like I mentioned before, actions can wrap business logic around mutations. So what we looked at earlier was one single action that set a loading status, made an API call. When it got the response, it reset the loading status, and then committed that final mutation, setting our state. So 2 mutations and some business logic all wrapped within an action. So to make this a little more tangible, Chris Fritz shared this metaphor with me a while back that I put into some graphics. So the difference between actions and mutations can kind of be thought about where if you were to ask your friend to pick up some bread for you, that picking up of the bread and actually having it in your possession is more like the mutation. The state of bread is true. You have it. Whereas the action is more like please pick up bread. So if possible, go and fetch the bread, and then basically you have it. Then it's true. But actions in Vue apps don't always commit their mutations because things can go wrong, or there might be some conditional logic that's running. An API call might not go how it is supposed to, or in this example, their car might break down, they're out of bread, etc. I'm just plugging Chris Frisk constantly. Yes, that's true. Patting each other's backs. It's back. Okay, so he recommends, and I agree, that we ought to always put mutations within actions. So even if you only have a single mutation, wrapping it within the action allows you essentially to future-proof your app, because even though you might not need right now that business logic around it, as your app scales, if you do end up needing to, it's going to be a lot less refactoring if you already have it wrapped within that action. So it increases scalability, and my current knowledge is that in Vue 3, mutations are going away. So my thought process is, if we think about actions being that which update the state even through these mutations that they're containing, once those mutations go away, it's still those actions that are doing it. They're not these lone mutations that are kind of not wrapped in actions. So yeah, mutations within actions is a best practice that is highly recommended. So let's see actions in action. We'll look at the example we were looking at earlier where we had that state of count. We have the increment count mutation, which just updates that count. But with this action now, we could write update count, which again takes in that context object, giving us access to both the state and the ability to commit mutations. And we could pass the payload initially into the action, which passes it to the mutation. And then in our template, cool. Then in our template, we instead of committing the mutation, again, we're dispatching the update count action, passing it that payload. So an extra step, but again, allows us to do some business logic for this kind of contrived example. If we have a user, we're going to commit that mutation, and again, increases scalability with that action. So far, we just looked at Vuex that only had that singular kind of root store file, and inside of which our state, mutations, actions, and getters all lived. And that's fine for a smaller app, but I would imagine if you're using Vuex, you intend for your app to get larger. So there are ways to avoid it getting messy in this one single large store file. There's ways to modularize your Vuex code. So you can think of it, maybe you have a user module, maybe you have a to-dos module, which each have their own state, actions, etc. And those essentially are branches that break off from the root store within your Vuex. And you can kind of fractal this, and even you could branch the user state smaller and smaller to get more and more modular. And there's ways to communicate efficiently amongst your modules. Cool, so that basically brings me to the end of this talk. It was kind of a preview of several lessons from our complete Mastering Vuex course on Vue Mastery. So if you are interested in implementing state management with Vuex in your Vue app, this is a great place to get started doing so. And I also wanted to make you aware we have our sponsor booth outside. So if you want any cheat sheets, we have the Vue 3 composition API cheat sheet. So we worked a bit with the core team. Evan even took a look at it. So it's got the most up-to-date Vue 3 composition API syntax so that you can start to familiarize yourself with that and kind of get ahead of the curve and get your head around what those new options are for you to write these Vue 3 components. We also have a Vue 3 Essentials course that my colleague Greg is nearly completed up on Vue Mastery. After that, we'll be doing a Vue 3 reactivity course. So we're already producing Vue 3 content, so if it's something that you kind of want to get ahead of, want to be one of the first people in your team to really understand the composition API and start being able to use it, we offer that ability to start learning. We also have stickers if you like to put stickers on your laptop, which I don't, but there's plenty of stickers if you want any. So, yep, that's my time. Thank you so much.